"You're not welcome at your own grandmother's funeral." That's the sentence that ripped through me like ice. I was standing in my tiny kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, half expecting this to be some sort of misunderstanding. But her voice wasn't shaky or sorrowful. It was sharp, controlled, cold. My Aunt Delora had always been cold. But this was a different kind of cruelty. I blinked hard, not even sure I heard her right. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I said you're not invited," she repeated slowly this time as if I were stupid. "Don't show up, Ava. This is for family." I felt my throat go dry. The room around me faded. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough to drown out everything else. "I am family," I finally managed to say. Her scoff crackled through the phone. "Not in the way that counts. You weren't close to her. You barely showed up the last few years. Grandma deserved better." And then she hung up. I just stood there, frozen. The hum of my fridge was the only sound in the room. I stared out the window, not really seeing anything. Just the empty, gray Seattle sky. I had no idea how long I stood there until I realized my hands were shaking. I slowly lowered the phone and sat down at my kitchen table like a puppet with cut strings. Not invited? What did that even mean? My grandma, Lillian Wren, was the only person in my family who actually saw me. Really saw me. While the rest of them treated me like some sort of artsy disappointment or emotional inconvenience, she never once made me feel less than. When I was 8, she was the one who encouraged me to draw. When I was 15 and sobbing on her couch after another fight with Dad, she brought me tea and just listened. No judgment, no fixing, just love. I visited her every month. I called her every Sunday. I brought her lemon cookies from the bakery down the street because she once offhandedly mentioned liking them. She kept my drawings pinned to her fridge until the day she died. And now Delora was telling me I didn't count? That I had no place at the one goodbye that truly mattered to me. I didn't cry at first. I just sat in that stunned, hollow silence, the kind where you feel like a ghost in your own body. But then the anger came. Slowly, sharply, and with it, the need for answers. I got up, dug through the drawer in the hallway where I kept Grandma's last letters. She was old school, handwritten notes, birthday cards, little scribbles she'd mail me just to say she was proud. As I thumbed through them, my fingers stopped on a small, thick envelope I didn't remember seeing before. It was cream-colored, sealed carefully. My name was written across the front in her curling script, "To Ava, to be opened upon my death." My breath caught. I held it for a few moments, fingers trembling. Was this real? Slowly, I broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter, and a second envelope, smaller, more official looking. I read the letter first. "My dearest Ava, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer around to tell you in person how deeply proud I am of the woman you've become. But you need to know this now, more than ever. You were never invisible to me. You were my joy, my safe harbor, my heart. I know the others won't welcome you at my funeral. That's why I've made arrangements. Please read the enclosed copy of my will when you are ready. Know that I made my decisions clearly and out of love. Not revenge. Love. Don't let them take your voice again. Stand tall, Ava. Always yours, Grandma." Tears blurred the words as I read. My chest heaved, and the sob finally came out like a storm. I clutched the letter to my chest and let myself cry. For her. For me. For every time I had swallowed my voice, just to keep the peace. I opened the second envelope. Inside was her will. A legal document, signed, notarized, official. It was all there in black and white. I, Lillian Wren, being of sound mind, leave my entire estate, my home, my savings, my artwork, and all personal belongings to my granddaughter Ava Wren, who honored me in life and never turned away. I stared at it. My heart thundered, not with joy, with clarity. They had tried to erase me from her death, but Grandma had already written me into her legacy, and I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. Before all of this, The will, the funeral, the silence in that room. I was just Ava. Quiet, artistic, a bit too soft according to my dad, a bit too distant according to my aunt, and definitely too invisible according to everyone else. I lived alone in a small apartment just outside Seattle, surrounded by plants, books, and sketch pads. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I worked as a freelance illustrator, mostly children's books and educational materials. Not the kind of career that made my father proud, but I didn't do it for pride. I did it because it was the only thing that ever made me feel like myself. My relationship with my family? Complicated, to put it kindly. My parents divorced when I was 12. My mom, Bethany, moved across the country to start over, and my dad, Greg Wren, was left to raise me in the shadow of his older sister, Delora. Delora had always run things. Holidays, decisions, opinions. If it happened in our family, she orchestrated it. She had a voice that filled a room and a gaze that could make you feel 2 inches tall. Her house was a parade of curated appearances, polished wood floors, velvet drapes, photos of Mira and Jake in matching outfits. I hated going there, but I always did. To keep the peace, to avoid the lectures. Delora's daughter, Mira, is a carbon copy of her mother, stylish, ambitious, and frankly exhausting. She worked in finance, and you could tell because she made sure you knew it. Her brother, Jake, was more reserved, always watching the chaos from a corner. We weren't close, but we shared the same glazed-over look at every family dinner. Then there was Grandma Lillian. She was different. My dad would roll his eyes and call her eccentric, but to me, she was warmth. She was the only adult in my life who never asked me to be someone else. When I brought her drawings, she studied them like museum pieces. When I spoke, she listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She just let me be. Every summer, from age 6 to 16, I stayed with her for a few weeks in her small house on Whidbey Island. She had a cluttered studio filled with oil paints, old photo albums, dusty typewriters, and one rocking chair that faced the sea. That chair became my sacred space. I used to sketch the boats that floated by and listen to her stories about growing up during the war, falling in love, raising kids, and watching the world change. She wasn't rich, but she had taste. She had a library filled with poetry and books on world art, and a garden that smelled like rosemary and lemons. It wasn't a mansion, but to me, it was magic. It felt like a world outside the judgment and noise of the rest of my life. As I got older and started working, I still visited. Once a month, I'd take the ferry, bring her those lemon cookies she loved, and we'd sit in the garden. Sometimes we'd talk about everything. Other times, we'd sit in comfortable silence while I sketched her roses. She always remembered the little things, my deadlines, my heartbreaks, the names of my clients. She'd clip articles about illustration trends and send them to me. Once, when I was worried about not getting enough work, she looked at me and said, "Ava, don't let their noise shrink your soul. You don't owe the world a performance. You owe it your truth." That line stayed with me. I didn't always believe it, but I tried. The rest of the family never saw that side of her. To them, she was just Mom or Gran, a woman who made good casseroles and left them birthday checks. They didn't understand why she kept old watercolors of mine framed in her hallway. They didn't get our connection. And I think, deep down, they resented it. Especially Delora. I remember one Thanksgiving maybe 2 years ago, Grandma had one too many glasses of wine and said loudly, "If I could be young again, I'd want to be just like Ava, brave enough to be soft in a hard world." The silence after that sentence felt like it lasted a lifetime. Delora gave me a look I'll never forget. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was something colder. Possessive. Like I had taken something she thought belonged to her. I didn't think much of it then. But looking back now, maybe that moment was the beginning of everything. Of the resentment. Of the plan to cut me out. Of the funeral where I wasn't welcome. Until the truth came out. To outsiders, the Wren family looked perfectly put together. Successful, traditional, picture frame worthy. But inside it was something else entirely. My father, Greg, was the kind of man who believed feelings were a sign of weakness. He didn't yell, not like some fathers do. His weapon of choice was silence, disappointment, the slow withdrawal of affection until you felt like you were performing for approval that would never come. I spent most of my childhood trying to earn his attention. I'd bring him drawings, tell him about the stories I wrote in school. Sometimes he'd nod. Most times he'd barely look up. But when my cousin Mira showed up with her straight A's and soccer trophies, he'd light up like a Christmas tree. That was the dynamic. Mira was the pride, and I was the project. And then there was Aunt Delora. She carried herself like a senator. Heels clicking, voice calm but layered with judgment. She didn't yell either. She didn't have to. Every comment came gift-wrapped in passive aggression. "Oh, Ava, still doing your little drawings? Must be nice to work from home in your pajamas." Well, not everyone's cut out for real structure. She'd say these things in front of the family, and everyone would laugh. Not because they thought it was funny, but because disagreeing with Delora was social suicide. Even my dad laughed. Family dinners were a performance. Delora at the head of the table, Mira recounting her latest corporate win, Jake scrolling his phone quietly, Greg sipping his scotch like he wanted to disappear, and me sitting in the corner, praying no one asked me about my work. Because if they did, it would become a debate about why I wasn't doing more with my degree or settling down like a normal adult. If I tried to defend myself, they'd smile and say I was too sensitive. Delora had this phrase she used when I was younger. "Don't take it personally, Ava. We just want what's best for you. What's best for you." That was the family motto. And it usually meant doing exactly what they expected. No questions, no dreams of your own, no individuality. Just smile, perform, conform. Grandma Lillian used to say, "Some families pass down recipes. Ours passes down roles." And she wasn't wrong. Delora was the enforcer. Greg was the disappointment avoider. Mira was the golden child. Jake was the shadow. And me? I was the reminder. The reminder of everything they couldn't control. The softness they tried to beat out of themselves, walking around in human form. I think Grandma saw that too. I think that's why she always made space for me, not just physically, but emotionally. She let me exist without explaining myself. She asked questions no one else asked. She listened without interrupting. When I told her about the first time I turned down a big ad agency job because I didn't want to be someone's corporate workhorse, she didn't say, "You're making a mistake." She said, "Good, you're not a machine." That kind of support? It made me a target, because in our family, love wasn't unconditional. It was transactional. It came with performance clauses. If you wanted affection, you earned it. If you wanted respect, you better succeed on their terms. And if you dared to be different, gentle, quiet, creative, you'd better prepare to be ignored. It took me a long time to realize this wasn't normal. When I was younger, I thought all families had a Delora. I thought every birthday dinner was supposed to feel like walking into a courtroom. I thought love was supposed to come with strings. It wasn't until I started meeting other people, friends, clients, even my therapist, that I saw how twisted it really was. They didn't just misunderstand me. They were actively erasing me. Sometimes in small ways, like cropping me out of group photos or forgetting to include me in family emails. Sometimes in bigger ways, like planning vacations and not inviting me, then pretending they thought I was busy. And every time I brought it up, "You're reading too much into it, Ava. You're too emotional. Just let things go." So I did. For years I let things go. I let myself shrink. I smiled through birthdays where no one asked me how I was doing. I sat through holidays where Delora made backhanded compliments and no one batted an eye. But the thing about shrinking yourself to make others comfortable, eventually you disappear. And by the time Grandma passed, I think they honestly believed I wouldn't fight back. That I'd just fade into the background, quietly mourning alone while they handled her legacy. They underestimated me. More importantly, they underestimated her. Because while they were planning my exclusion, Grandma was planning something else. Something that would turn every power dynamic in that family on its head. It was a gray Thursday morning when the call came. I was working on a set of illustrations for a children's book about forest animals, sipping lukewarm coffee and layering soft strokes of watercolor onto a baby fox. My phone buzzed on the counter. When I saw my dad's name, Greg Wren, flash across the screen, my chest tightened. We didn't speak often, not unless something was wrong. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. His voice was flat, almost robotic. "She's gone." It took me a moment to process. "What?" "Your grandmother. She passed in her sleep last night." The paintbrush slipped from my fingers. I stared at the tiny fox on the paper, now smeared with a watery streak. Gone. Just like that. I didn't cry. Not at first. My heart raced, but my brain refused to catch up. My dad's voice kept going, saying something about how the doctor said it was peaceful, how they'd found her in bed with a book resting on her chest. That image did it. Tears welled up in my eyes, thick and burning. "When's the funeral?" I asked. There was a pause. Then, oddly, a sigh. "You should call Delora about that," he said. "She's handling the arrangements." I hung up and stared out the window for a while, watching the clouds drift like ghosts. Then I called Delora. I should have expected what was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for the way she said it, as casually as if she were reading a grocery list. "You're not invited." My stomach dropped. I don't understand. I was close with her. I loved her. "That's not how it looked to us, Ava," she said with a clipped tone. "You were never really involved. This is a family thing." "I am family." "You chose to separate yourself," she snapped. "We're keeping this intimate. For the people who were actually there for her." She made it sound so clean, so easy. As if my visits, my calls, my Sunday talks with Grandma never happened. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask how she could erase me like that. But all I managed to say was, "You can't keep me from saying goodbye." "I can, and I am. If you show up, you'll be escorted out." Then she hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time. I felt like I'd been sucker punched. All the air rushed out of me. I curled up on the couch and just sobbed. Deep, ugly sobs that cracked my chest open. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked my apartment in circles, replaying the call over and over. Was I overreacting? Had I really imagined the bond I had with Grandma? Was Delora right? The next morning, I went to the cabinet where I kept all of Grandma's letters and cards. I needed something real, some proof that what we had was genuine. That's when I found it. The thick, cream-colored envelope, buried under a pile of old birthday cards. To Ava. To be opened upon my death. The breath left my body. I opened it with trembling hands. The letter inside was handwritten, warm, loving, and deeply intentional. And at the end of it she mentioned a second document, her will enclosed in the envelope. I unfolded the will slowly, reading line by line, as if I didn't trust my eyes. She left everything to me. Her house on Woodby Island, her savings account, her artwork, her journals. All of it. It wasn't just about the money or property. It was about the meaning, the statement. She hadn't forgotten me. She hadn't believed the lies they told about me. She'd seen the truth and made her decision. That moment changed everything. I wasn't just the quiet niece anymore. I wasn't the outsider or the disappointment. I was her choice. And now I had a choice to make too. I could keep letting this family shut me out. I could grieve quietly, in the corner where they thought I belonged. Or I could walk into that funeral, not to make a scene, but to honor the woman who never stopped believing in me, even when everyone else tried to erase me. I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice. And maybe a little bit of closure. After reading Grandma's letter and will, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything close to relief. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped everything out of my chest and left nothing but weight. I sat at my kitchen table for hours, the document still spread out in front of me, her signature at the bottom. My name printed again and again in legal clarity. My throat felt raw, like I'd been screaming, even though I hadn't said a word. I wanted to call someone. But who? Not my father. He already chose silence. Not Mira or Jake. They were either too involved or too indifferent. Not Delora. Obviously. The only person I wanted to talk to was gone. I found myself whispering aloud, "Why did you leave me, Grandma?" Then, like a reflex, I apologized out loud for saying it, for sounding selfish, for not being strong enough. It was instinctual, how quickly I tried to shrink my emotions before they made anyone uncomfortable. Even alone, I still had the habit. I didn't eat that day, didn't shower. I just drifted from room to room like a ghost in my own home. I curled up under the throw blanket she gave me last Christmas, a knitted thing in this hideous lavender color I never had the heart to tell her I hated. It still smelled like her house, like lavender soap and old paper. I cried quietly into it until I ran out of tears, but grief wasn't the only thing in the room. There was something else right beneath the surface. Rage. Not loud, not explosive, but sharp. Like glass just under the skin. The more I thought about it, the more it burned. They were rewriting the truth. Delora, my dad, everyone, pretending like I was never close to her, like I didn't matter, like I didn't even exist in her world. And they did it so easily, so confidently, as if it were their right. I started remembering things, tiny details I had buried to keep the peace. The time they forgot to tell me about Mira's engagement party, or the Christmas when they gave everyone matching jackets and acted surprised when I didn't bring mine. Didn't you get the group text? No, I hadn't. I never did. It had always been like this. Delora wanted control. She craved the narrative. Grandma was the only one who ever resisted her. And now that she was gone, Delora assumed she could finally remove me from the story altogether. But Grandma didn't let that happen. She saw what was coming. She knew how they'd twist it. And she made sure I had a voice when she no longer could. Still, that didn't take away the pain of being cast out. The funeral wasn't just about saying goodbye to her. It was a place I should have belonged. I should have stood next to her casket. I should have lit a candle in her name. I should have hugged someone who knew what this loss meant. Instead, I was grieving in silence, mourning in exile. I started wondering what they'd say about me at the funeral. Would they even mention me? Would they pretend I was just a distant relative who faded out of her life? Would they lie about why I wasn't there? That thought sent me over the edge. I grabbed my journal and started writing. Fast, messy, barely legible. Not to publish, not to post. Just to get it out. I wrote down every memory I had of her, every story she told, every piece of advice, every time she wiped my tears, every time she reminded me that my voice mattered. When I finally stopped, I realized I'd filled almost 15 pages. My hand ached, but I felt a little less alone. She hadn't abandoned me. They had. And now I had a choice to make. I could stay here in this cocoon of pain, quietly swallow it like I had every other insult, every other slight, every dinner where I was told to be grateful just to be included. Or I could do something. I didn't know what that looked like yet. Not exactly, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to be erased. Not from Grandma's life, not from her death, not from the legacy she left behind. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be quiet. The morning after I poured my grief into those 15 journal pages, I woke up with a headache, red eyes, and one clear, undeniable thought. I had nothing to feel guilty for. That single realization shifted something in me. I wasn't the one who lied. I wasn't the one who excluded. I hadn't abandoned anyone. I had loved Grandma with my whole heart, openly and consistently. The only crime I'd committed was not being who my family wanted me to be, and I was done apologizing for it. For so long, I'd been conditioned to believe that if I stayed small, if I kept quiet, they'd eventually accept me. That if I was patient, respectful, and unbothered, I'd be invited back in. But what Grandma's death, and Delora's cruelty, finally made me see was this. Their acceptance was never real. It was conditional. and I was tired of living a life where love came with a checklist. After breakfast, a real one for the first time in days, I sat down at my desk with Grandma's letter and will. I read them again, slowly this time, soaking in every word. I circled the phrases that struck me. You were never invisible to me. I made my decisions out of love. Stand tall, Ava. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I Googled estate attorneys, not because I wanted to sue anyone, not because I was greedy or angry or trying to prove a point. I just needed to know if the will was real, valid, enforceable. I didn't want justice through revenge. I wanted clarity through truth. I booked a consultation and spoke with a lawyer named Rosa Salgado, a sharp, kind woman with the kind of voice that makes you feel like someone's finally listening. I scanned and sent her the documents. She called me back within hours. It's solid, she said. Signed, notarized, witnessed. Your grandmother left very little room for ambiguity. Everything legally belongs to you. My hands trembled as I held the phone. So, they can't contest it? They can try, Rosa said. But unless they can prove fraud or mental incompetence, they don't have a case. It's yours, Ava. Mine. The word echoed in my mind like it didn't quite belong to me yet. That night, I pulled out one of my old sketchbooks and began to draw. Not for a client, not for a paycheck, just for me. I sketched the rocking chair on Grandma's porch, her wild garden, her crooked smile. I filled the page with her essence, and for the first time since she passed, I felt something like warmth. This was my way of bringing her back into the room. The more I drew, the more I remembered who I was outside of their opinions. I remembered the little girl who used to line up colored pencils like soldiers. I remembered the teenager who mailed art school applications in secret because her father said, real careers don't involve crayons. I remembered the young woman who moved to Seattle with 2 suitcases and a dream she was too scared to say out loud. I remembered me, and I realized Delora couldn't take that from me. None of them could. Yes, they'd tried to erase me. From the funeral, from the story, from the family narrative. But Grandma made sure I had a voice. And now it was my turn to use it. Not out of spite, not even out of anger, but because I deserved to show up for the woman who always showed up for me. That week I booked a ferry ticket, not for revenge, for truth. I started planning what I'd wear, not to be seen, but to feel strong. I chose a simple black dress, one Grandma had complimented once. You look like someone who knows her own worth, she'd said. And now, I did. I stood in front of the mirror and practiced reading the letter aloud. My hands shook at first. My voice cracked. But by the 5th time, I was steady. Because I wasn't just reading a will. I was reclaiming a voice they had spent years trying to silence. They told me I didn't belong, but Grandma had left me the final word, and I was going to speak it, clearly, calmly, and without shame. I didn't decide to go to the funeral to make a scene. I decided to go because they didn't get the last word. For days, I played their words over and over in my head. Delora's voice, sharp and smug. You're not invited? My father's indifference, his unwillingness to challenge her. The way I'd been dismissed, erased, as if the years I spent loving Grandma didn't matter. But it wasn't about them anymore. It was about her. And if I stayed quiet now, if I let fear win, I would be betraying the one person who never asked me to be anyone other than exactly who I was. So I started preparing. Not emotionally. That part was still messy and raw, and would probably stay that way for a while. I prepared logistically, quietly, intentionally, strategically. First, I contacted Rosa, the estate lawyer. I've decided to attend the funeral, I told her. There was a brief pause on the line. Then, do you want me to come with you? I blinked. I hadn't even considered that. Would that make a difference? It might, she said. Legally, it doesn't change anything. But people behave differently when someone walks in with a lawyer beside them. It tells the room you're not just a girl with paper. You're a woman with power. I smiled. Not because I felt powerful, but because she was right. That's what this was about. Not intimidation, but presence. "I'll let you know," I said. Next, I pulled out Grandma's will and made a few photocopies. One for me to carry, one to leave behind in case anything happened, and one just to keep in my purse like a talisman. Then I picked out the letter, the one she'd written just to me, the one I would read at her service whether they liked it or not. I didn't care if they rolled their eyes, stormed out, or whispered behind my back. This wasn't their goodbye. It was mine. As I prepared, something shifted inside me. I no longer felt like the outsider begging for a seat at their table. I felt like someone building her own. One night, I laid out everything on my bed: documents, clothes, Grandma's jewelry box. I ran my fingers over the clasp of her silver bracelet, the one I used to admire when I was little. She left it to me in the will. I hadn't worn it in years. That night, I fastened it around my wrist. I wasn't superstitious, but it felt like armor. A few days before the funeral, I called Jake, Delora's son. He was the only person in the family who had ever seemed remotely neutral. I didn't expect support, but I figured he had the right to know. "Hey," I said when he answered. "I just wanted you to hear it from me. I'm coming to the funeral." Silence. Then he sighed. "Honestly, I was hoping you would." I blinked. "You were?" "She loved you," he said simply. "Everyone knew it, even my mom. Especially her." I didn't cry, but my eyes stung. Jake didn't offer to take sides. He didn't promise backup. But that one comment told me I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't crazy. Someone else had seen it too. The day before the funeral, I wrote down everything I wanted to say, then rewrote it, then again. But every version ended with the same line. "She saw me. When none of you did, she saw me." And that's what I clung to. Not revenge, not pettiness, just truth. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to turn her funeral into a courtroom or a stage. But I also wasn't going to let them bury my relationship with her alongside her casket. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, they could keep pretending. But they'd have to do it while I stood at the front of that room, reading her words, wearing her bracelet, holding her letter, claiming my place. I wasn't going to scream or argue or explain myself. I was going to do something that would make them uncomfortable in a completely different way. I was going to show up fully as myself. No apology, no shame, no asking for permission. The sky was a pale, brittle gray the morning of the funeral. It matched everything I felt. Tight, numb, heavy. I didn't dress to make a statement. I wore a simple black dress with long sleeves, the one Grandma once said made me look elegant and unbothered. I slipped on her silver bracelet, the one she wore to every holiday dinner, and pulled my hair back the way she used to, with the side part tucked behind one ear. The service was being held at a modest white chapel in the outskirts of town, the kind of place where everything echoed: grief, judgment, silence. The parking lot was full when I arrived. I sat in the car for a few minutes watching people I hadn't seen in years file in. Some I recognized, some I didn't. And then I saw her. Delora. She stood on the church steps like a gatekeeper, black shawl over her shoulders, sunglasses perched too high on her nose. Her expression was stone. As I approached, her head snapped toward me. Her lips parted slightly. Whether in shock or disgust, I couldn't tell. She stepped forward, arms crossed. "I told you not to come." I met her eyes, heart hammering. "And I told you this wasn't your decision to make." "I'll call security," she hissed. I held up the will, calm, steady. "You can, but I'd suggest reading this first." Her eyes darted down. She didn't reach for it, but the color in her face changed, just for a second. A flicker of panic, expertly buried. "She left everything to me," I said. "The house, the estate, the records, which includes the right to speak at this funeral." "You're making a scene," she snapped. I took a breath. "Number, I'm making sure she's remembered by someone who actually knew her." Without waiting for her permission, I walked past her. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with soft murmurs and the smell of lilies. A slideshow of Grandma's life flickered on a screen, photos of her as a young girl, then a mother, then a grandmother. I saw images of Delora, of my father, of Mira and Jake. None of me. Not a single photo. But I didn't flinch. I took my seat in the second row, alone. The service began with hymns, then a generic eulogy from the pastor. It was polite, sanitized, like a resume. No mention of her garden, her jokes. The way she insisted on using a fountain pen, even in the age of texts and emails. They made her sound like a polite memory, not the force of love and wisdom she was. I waited, and when the pastor opened the floor for tributes, I stood. Delora's head whipped toward me. Mira's jaw dropped. My father stiffened in his seat, but didn't stop me. I walked to the front, clutching Grandma's letter. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just read. My dearest Ava, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer around to tell you in person how deeply proud I am of the woman you've become. I read every word, every line she wrote me, every sentence soaked in love and intention, about how she saw me, how I made her proud, how I gave her hope in her final years. And then I read from the will. To my granddaughter Ava Wren, who honored me in life and never turned away, I leave my home, my belongings, and my legacy. By the time I finished, the room was silent. No coughing, no murmurs, just stillness. I looked out at their faces, some shocked, some guilty, some just confused. And then I said the only thing I hadn't read. I was told I didn't belong here, but this letter, and that will say otherwise. This wasn't about inheritance. It was about being seen, about love that wasn't conditional. So I'm not here to fight. I'm here to say thank you. Thank you for being my family when the rest of you chose not to be. I stepped away from the podium. I didn't look at Delora. I didn't need to. I walked straight down the aisle, out the door, into the cold morning air. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away in shame. I was walking away in truth. The morning after the funeral, I took the early ferry to Whidbey Island. The air was brisk, and the water was still, like the ocean was holding its breath. I stood on the deck, bundled in my coat, clutching a leather satchel that held the will, the letter, and Grandma's house key. I hadn't been back since her death, not even when I found out the house was mine. Part of me couldn't face the quiet yet. Part of me didn't believe it was real. But as the ferry pulled into the harbor, I saw it. Her little gray house up on the hill, tucked between tall trees and wrapped in a garden that was wild and unbothered, just like she liked it. I took a cab and got out at the end of the gravel driveway. My boots crunched against the stones. Everything looked the same, but the silence carried a different weight now. I stood in front of the door for a long time before I put the key in. It clicked like it had never been used by anyone but me. Inside, the air smelled like lavender and cedar. I could almost hear her humming from the kitchen. I walked through each room slowly, touching the fabric of the couch, the old record player, the books still open on the side table. It was as if she had just stepped out to the garden and would be back in a minute. I went to the studio last. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. Her easel was still set up. Brushes laid out. A half-finished canvas of a girl in a garden. Me, I realized. She never got to finish it. That's when I finally cried. But this time, the tears weren't bitter. They weren't full of rage or shame or grief I couldn't name. These tears were about belonging, about knowing, really knowing, that I had been loved without performance, without condition. She left me this place not because I was perfect. She left it to me because I had shown up, because I had listened, because I had sat with her, drawn with her, held her hand when the world didn't, because I had seen her, and she had seen me. I took the canvas off the easel and gently set it aside. Then I pulled out my own sketchbook, sat where she always sat, and started drawing. I drew a boat in the harbor like I had when I was a child. I drew the sunflowers she planted every spring. I drew the rocking chair by the window. I drew her. It was the first time in weeks I'd been able to breathe without heaviness. This was the victory. Not the house, not the money. This. Sitting in her space, continuing her spirit, building something of my own from the place where I was always allowed to just be. Later that week, Rosa, the estate lawyer, called to say the paperwork was complete. The transfer of the home and assets was official. I was, in every legal sense, the sole inheritor. "You have full control over the estate," she said. "No one can contest it." I could hear the smile in her voice. She knew what this meant. Still, I asked her to send a formal letter to Delora and my father. Nothing harsh. Just a copy of the official transfer, and a note thanking them for respecting Grandma's wishes moving forward. I didn't want to gloat. I just wanted the record corrected. That same day, I made one more choice. I contacted a local arts foundation on the island and told them I wanted to start a small scholarship in Grandma's name for young women in the arts who felt unseen or unsupported by their families. I offered to fund it using a portion of the money she left me. They said yes. A few weeks later, I held a soft launch for it. Quiet. Just a few people. But as I stood there, reading Grandma's favorite quote, "Don't let the world shrink your soul," I realized what I was doing. I wasn't just claiming her legacy, I was continuing it. She had passed me the baton, not to fight the family, not to win, but to build. To create something that would outlast bitterness, that would speak louder than any insult they threw at me. In her death, she gave me the freedom to live more honestly than I ever had. That was the real inheritance. In the weeks after the funeral, the silence from my father and Delora was deafening, but not surprising. There were no phone calls, no emails, no half-hearted apologies or backpedaling. Just nothing. And to be honest, that was fine. Because something unexpected started happening. Other people, my people, began to show up. It started with a text from Jake, Delora's son. It came the night after the funeral, while I was sitting on Grandma's porch under a wool blanket, trying to draw, but mostly just staring at the trees. "That was brave today," she would have been proud. "For what it's worth, I always knew you two were close." It was short, simple, but it hit me harder than I expected. He didn't try to smooth things over. He didn't try to excuse his mom. He just acknowledged what everyone else pretended wasn't true. And it mattered. Then, a few days later, Nina, my childhood best friend, drove up from the city without even asking. She showed up on my doorstep with a bottle of wine, a bag of takeout, and the kind of hug that says you don't have to explain a thing. "I've been following the situation," she said gently after we settled into the living room. "I didn't want to overwhelm you, but I also didn't want you to go through it alone." I didn't realize how badly I needed her there until I felt my shoulders drop. I had been so tense for so long, I'd forgotten what ease felt like. We sat up late into the night, talking about Grandma, about grief, about family that doesn't always deserve that title. At one point, I read her part of the letter Grandma left me. When I looked up, she had tears in her eyes. "She saw you, Ava," she said. "Not just in the way we say that to comfort people. I mean, really, really saw you. That kind of love, that's sacred. That's the kind you build your life around." That line stuck with me. That's the kind you build your life around. In the days that followed, more support came in quiet, meaningful waves. A former professor I hadn't spoken to in years emailed me after seeing a social media post about the scholarship. She told me how proud she was to see me turning pain into purpose. One of my illustration clients, a mother whose daughter I'd once drawn into a bedtime storybook, sent a handwritten letter. "My daughter believes your drawings are magic," she wrote. "I think she's right." Even the owner of the local art supply store on the island, an older man named Paul who had known Grandma for decades, stopped me one morning while I was buying new sketch pads. "She used to talk about you every time you came to visit," he said. "Said you had a rare kind of heart. Glad to see you're still drawing." These weren't grand gestures. They were small, sincere acknowledgments. But after years of being dismissed, minimized, and edited out of my own story, every single one felt monumental. And the more I opened up, quietly, carefully, the more I realized something important. I had been loved, all along. Just not always by the people I was born to. The people who saw me weren't necessarily the ones who shared my last name. They were the ones who stayed when things got uncomfortable. The ones who didn't ask me to change in order to be loved. The ones who, when I spoke the truth, even if it was messy, said, "I believe you." That, I was learning, was family too. Chosen family. The kind that doesn't gatekeep grief. The kind that doesn't ask you to earn your seat at the table. The kind that simply says, "You're already enough." As I sat one afternoon in Grandma's studio with Nina, our mugs steaming in our hands, she asked me, "Do you think you'll ever talk to them again?" I paused. "Maybe," I said. "If they ever choose truth over control. If they come to the table as humans, not as judges." She nodded, not pressing for more. We both knew it wasn't about needing them anymore. Because I wasn't alone. And I wasn't invisible. I had community. And that, after everything they tried to take, felt like the real inheritance. I didn't need to say anything else to Delora after the funeral. I didn't threaten. I didn't argue. I didn't send any angry emails or carefully worded "just so you know" texts. The truth spoke for itself. The will was real. The documents were legal. The lawyer's letter arrived at her house 3 days later. And from what I've heard, that's when the unraveling began. It started with whispers. Extended relatives, people I barely knew or only saw at weddings and memorials, began reaching out. One by one, like cautious witnesses finally ready to speak. A second cousin, Melanie, sent me a message on Facebook. "I had no idea Lillian left everything to you. That must have taken a lot of strength to read at the funeral. I always thought you were close with her, but Delora told us you'd stopped visiting years ago." Stopped visiting? The lie burned even now. I responded calmly, attaching a photo of me and Grandma from just last month. Us laughing over tea in her garden, a stack of my sketches on her lap. The caption read, "She never missed a Sunday call." And I never missed a chance to bring her lemon cookies. Melanie heart-reacted the message and replied, "That's what I thought. I'm so sorry they did that to you." More messages came. A former neighbor from Grandma's street wrote me a kind note saying, "I always saw your car in the driveway. You were the only one who helped her with groceries." The woman from her book club emailed to say, "She talked about you every week. Always said you were the one person who never judged her aging mind." They hadn't expected all these people to remember. They hadn't planned for the quiet witnesses, but they were there, watching, listening, and now, speaking. Then came the biggest shift. Grandma's longtime accountant, Mr. Adler, sent a formal letter to my lawyer, Rosa. Inside was a record of the estate planning sessions he'd had with Grandma in the final year of her life. Handwritten notes, timestamps, even signed statements confirming that Grandma was fully coherent and firm in her wishes each time they met. The most damning detail? Grandma had told him specifically that she didn't trust Delora to carry out her final wishes. She'd said, in writing, that she feared Delora would minimize Ava's role in my life, if given the chance. And yet, Delora had tried to do just that. Rosa gently asked me if I wanted to pursue legal action. I sat with that question for a long time, and in the end I said no. Delora's punishment was already unfolding in real time, not in courtrooms, but in conversations she couldn't control anymore. Her image as the family matriarch, the one in charge, the keeper of tradition, it was cracked now. People had seen something they couldn't unsee. They had seen her try to erase me, and fail. I heard that Mira, her daughter, had asked her directly, "Why didn't you tell us Grandma left everything to Ava?" Delora's response? Silence. Then anger. Then retreat. Because when control slips away, people like her don't know who they are. Even my father, who had always hidden behind Delora's shadow, began to shrink in the aftermath. A cousin told me he'd become embarrassingly quiet at a family brunch, offering no defense, no justification. Just a weak shrug. They had spent so long building their narrative, they never imagined it could be rewritten. But it had. Not by force, not by yelling, just by showing up with the truth and letting it breathe. And it was enough. One afternoon, as I was sweeping the porch at Grandma's house, I got a handwritten card in the mail. From Jake. It's strange watching everything fall apart back home. But maybe it needed to. I don't want to pretend anymore. I just wanted to say thank you. For saying what no one else had the guts to say. And for making sure her story ended the way it should have. I held the card in my hands for a long time. Not all exposure happens under bright lights. Sometimes it's slow. A rumor that dies when the truth is spoken plainly. A lie that collapses under the weight of real love. A reputation that crumbles, not from rage, but from finally being seen through. And once people see the truth, they can't unsee it. I used to think closure looked like a conversation. A moment where they'd look me in the eye and finally say, we were wrong. But the more distance I got from the funeral, the will and the fallout, the more I understood something that shifted everything. Closure doesn't always come from them. Sometimes it comes from you. And mine came slowly, in quiet acts of defiance that didn't feel rebellious until I saw them for what they were. Acts of self-respect. The day after Jake's card arrived, I walked into Grandma's kitchen and opened the top drawer of the old pine desk where she kept her personal things. Inside was a thick, worn envelope labeled Greg's letters. My father's letters. Old ones. Some going back decades. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I took the envelope, walked it outside, and buried it beneath the rosemary bush she planted. Not out of spite. Out of peace. I no longer needed to know why he was the way he was. I didn't need one more reason to justify his silence, or his loyalty to Delora, or the fact that he hadn't called me once since the funeral. That wasn't mine to carry anymore. My job was no longer to translate their behavior into something I could live with. My job was to live. And that meant protecting what Grandma had seen in me, what she'd believed in me. She had passed down more than a house. She'd passed down a different kind of legacy. A new pattern. A pattern of choice, not obligation. Of love that wasn't earned through performance. For the first time in my life, I wrote my own version of a family code. A set of values I would live by, and one day, maybe, pass on to others. I wrote them down on a piece of recycled paper and taped them above my drafting table. I don't owe anyone a smaller version of myself. Silence doesn't equal peace. Real love makes space, not demands. I will not explain away cruelty, not even when it's dressed in tradition. I am not the problem just because I refuse to carry the family shame. I read them aloud every morning for a week. They weren't for anyone else's approval. They were a compass, a quiet rebellion against years of being told I had to earn my worth, and I began to live by them. I turned down a well-paying commission from a luxury brand that once ghosted me for being too emotional in tone. Instead, I accepted a contract to illustrate a memoir by a young woman who had survived foster care and wanted to write a book for girls who'd never been picked. I knew what that felt like. I began to teach free weekend sketching workshops in Grandma's garden, now transformed into a creative space. We called it the garden table. Kids came with wide eyes and nervous hands. Adults came too, unsure of their creativity, but tired of hiding from themselves. At the first session, I told them, "You don't have to be perfect here. You just have to be honest." They nodded. Some cried. I think that's when I realized I wasn't just building a life. I was building a boundary, not a wall to keep everyone out, but a clear, quiet line that said, "This is who I am now. If you want access to me, come with respect. Come with truth. Anything less will be met with distance. Not anger, not revenge, just disconnection." I didn't need to confront my father or argue with Delora again. They were used to drama. They were prepared for conflict, but they weren't prepared for silence with integrity. That was my power now. I stopped hoping they'd come around. Because I had. I'd come around to myself. I was no longer the girl at the edge of the family table, desperate to be seen. I was the woman rebuilding her own. And the only people who sat at it now were the ones who didn't flinch at my truth. The house didn't change much on the outside. The same shutters, the same peeling front steps, the same cedar tree out front that dropped sticky pods on my shoes every spring. But inside, something was entirely different. Me. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was choosing, creating, building. And it started small, like most real things do. The first thing I did was turn Grandma's studio into a shared art space. Not a gallery, not some stiff, silent room full of rules. Just a warm, open space with paint-splattered floors, wide tables, mismatched chairs, and a wall of pinned-up sketches that didn't care if the lines were straight or the perspective was correct. I called it the garden table, after the name I scribbled in my notebook that night after the funeral. I didn't announce it on social media or make it into some polished, curated brand. I made flyers at the local print shop and taped them to telephone poles. I put one at the co-op. I handed them to people at the bakery where Grandma used to buy her sourdough rolls. Within a week, I had 4 people in the studio. Then 8. Then 12. Mothers with their kids. Retired women who hadn't held a brush since high school. Teenagers who didn't know where else to go. We didn't talk about family dynamics or trauma or healing. We just drew. And in that space, people softened. Not because they were told to, but because no one asked them to be anything else. And in giving them that space, I was giving it to myself too. Rebuilding my future wasn't about escaping my past. It was about refusing to live by its rules. I made peace with the grief. I even made peace with the silence that followed the reading of the will. I stopped checking my inbox for a message that wasn't coming. I stopped wondering if my father would ever reach out. I stopped hoping Delora would find some sliver of humility and call me. It wasn't about bitterness. It was about energy. I had too many lives to touch, too many things to build, too many pieces of myself I was just starting to uncover. The scholarship I created in Grandma's name launched quietly in the fall. We awarded it to 2 recipients that first year, a high school senior named Kylie, who painted with bold colors and fierce honesty, and a first-year college student named Imani, who wanted to become an art therapist. When I told them they'd won, I cried harder than they did, because they weren't just names on paper. They were younger versions of me, girls trying to create beauty while being told their dreams weren't practical or impressive enough. Grandma would have loved them. That winter, I was invited to speak at a local community event, an open mic night for women artists. I almost said no, but something told me I needed to show up. When it was my turn, I walked onto the tiny stage in the community center, holding the original letter Grandma had written me, and I read it. The room was quiet, not out of obligation, but out of connection. I could feel it. When I finished, I looked up and said, "Sometimes family is not where you came from. Sometimes it's what you build from the rubble. Sometimes it's a letter you weren't supposed to receive, a voice you weren't supposed to find, and a love you weren't supposed to inherit, but did anyway." The crowd stood, not in explosive applause, but slowly, with the kind of respect that doesn't need to be loud to be real. Afterward, a woman in her 60s came up to me and took my hand. Her voice trembled as she said, "I didn't know anyone else had a story like mine." And I realized this was the future. Not just paint and programs. Not just houses and healing spaces. Connection, truth, continuity. A future where women like me, like her, like Grandma, weren't edited out. We were writing our own stories now. And mine was just getting started. It had been almost 6 months since the funeral when I got the card. A small, cream envelope, no return address, but the handwriting was familiar, angular and efficient, like someone trying to be neat but refusing to slow down. It was from my father. Inside was a simple card, blank except for one short line, written in blue ink. I was wrong. "I hope you're doing well." No signature, no excuses, No effort to explain or rewrite the past. Just that. And I sat there at the kitchen table, card in one hand, tea cooling in the other, unsure how to feel. 6 months ago, that card would have gutted me. I would have read it over and over, hunting for meaning, wondering if it was the start of something. I would have rehearsed my response, heart racing, hoping for a version of the father I always needed, but never really had. But now, I just felt still, not angry, not vindicated, just quietly aware of how much had changed. He hadn't called. He hadn't shown up. He hadn't defended me when his sister erased me from Grandma's funeral like I was a forgotten footnote. But here he was, offering something, a crack in the wall, and for some reason, I didn't throw it away. I placed the card in a small wooden box I kept on the windowsill, the same one that held Grandma's fountain pen, the first lemon cookie recipe she ever wrote down for me, and a pressed daisy from her garden. Not because I wanted to forget what he'd done, but because part of healing I was learning was deciding what to carry and what to set down. A week later, I sent him a reply, a short note written without venom or expectation. Thank you for your card. I'm doing well. I hope you are too. I've started a scholarship in Grandma's name and reopened her art studio to the community. I think she'd be happy about that. That was it. No invitation, no catch-up questions, no attempt to rebuild something that was never truly built in the first place. Just acknowledgement, from one person to another. And in a way, that was more powerful than some tearful, made-for-TV reunion. I didn't need his apology to be whole, but I accepted it for what it was. A small signal, a hesitant olive branch, a nod to the truth that could no longer be denied. I never heard from Delora. Not directly, but I got updates through cousins and extended relatives who'd begun reaching out to me more often. One told me she had moved on from the family drama, another that she was keeping her distance from all of it. I didn't press. I didn't care. If there was ever a version of reconciliation between me and Delora, it would come years from now, if it came at all, and only under new rules. Rules I set. Because forgiveness, I'd come to understand, didn't mean re-entry. Forgiveness meant freedom. It meant I could drive past their houses without shrinking. I could see their names in my inbox and feel curiosity instead of dread. I could hear their version of the story and not lose my grip on mine. That's the difference between healing and pretending. One lets you move forward. The other keeps you circling the same wound. Some people earn their way back into your life. Others simply get released from it. I wasn't holding a grudge, but I wasn't holding the door open either. The door existed. It was there. But if they ever wanted to walk through it, they'd have to come without excuses, without defensiveness, without expectations. Just truth, and humility, and respect. That's the cost of entry now. And that boundary? It's not bitterness. It's dignity. It was a warm spring morning when I finally returned to the garden. The daffodils had just started blooming, early this year, like they couldn't wait. The rosemary bush was thriving, wild and fragrant. Grandma would have loved that. I stood barefoot in the grass, cup of tea in hand, just watching the sunlight move across the yard like it was painting everything gold. The same yard where I used to sit beside her while she told stories about her youth. The same spot where I first drew a crooked sketch of her garden gate when I was 10. It was still there, rusted, squeaky, charmingly stubborn. There was no dramatic moment, no cinematic swell of music, just me, present, whole, quietly changed. And that, after everything, was enough. I walked over to the large wooden table we had moved into the garden a few weeks earlier. The garden table. We had sealed it with varnish, but left the surface raw so that the scratches and paint stains would remain. A history of every class, every laugh, every soul brave enough to create something from nothing. On the table was a leather-bound journal. I opened it. It was our community book, where visitors wrote messages after every class. Some were simple. Thank you. Others were profound. This space helped me feel seen again. I didn't think I could still draw. Turns out I just needed someone to tell me it didn't have to be perfect. As I flipped through the pages, I saw my name mentioned more than once. Not with praise, but with gratitude. With recognition. The way Grandma used to see me. And I realized something. I had become for others what she had been for me. A quiet witness, a mirror, a place to rest. Not because I set out to be anyone's guide, but because I finally stopped hiding. And that gave other people permission to stop hiding too. That was the lesson I didn't know I was learning all along. When they tried to exclude me from Grandma's funeral, they thought they were cutting me out of the story. But what they really did, what they accidentally, beautifully, unintentionally did, was force me to tell it myself. And in telling that story, I found my voice. Not the version I used to beg for at family dinners. Not the one I polished for approval, but the real one. The one that didn't ask for permission to exist. The one that knew its own value, even if no one clapped for it. As the wind passed through the trees, I looked down at the garden path and noticed something. A small stone partially buried in the dirt. I bent down, brushed it off. It was one of the painted stones we had decorated during our first art session. On it, written in purple paint, "Speak even if your voice shakes." I smiled. I remembered the girl who painted it, nervous, quiet, unsure of herself. And yet here her words were, outlasting the fear. I picked up the stone and placed it at the center of the table. Then I sat down, pulled out my sketchbook, and began to draw. Not for an audience, not for legacy, just because I wanted to, just because I could. And as I traced the lines of the garden, the table, and the first bloom of daffodils, I felt it. Peace, not the kind that comes from everyone agreeing, but the kind that comes from no longer needing them to. I thought about the young women who would receive Grandma's scholarship, the letters they would open, the supplies they would buy, the first strokes of art they would make in tiny dorm rooms with too much noise. They wouldn't know the full story, but they would feel it. And that, I think, is the quiet magic of healing. You don't always get the apology. You don't always get the scene. You don't always get the moment where they say, "You were right." But you get yourself, and you get to decide how the story ends. Mine ends here, for now, with a garden in bloom, with a pen in my hand, with a voice I no longer question, and with a woman I'm proud to be. If you've ever been silenced, sidelined, or made to feel small, this story is for you. Not to relive the pain, but to remind you that truth can survive even the deepest erasure. Speak it, live it, and share it. Because your voice matters.